Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Patricia Carter sighed with performative grief, patting Evelyn Carter's hand in front of the entire charity board while announcing that her niece's recent instability made her unfit to manage the estate. The room, a cavernous ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and the cloying scent of white lilies, went deathly silent. Donors froze with champagne flutes halfway to their lips. Evelyn didn't pull her hand away. She forced her fingers to remain limp, playing the part of the shattered victim Patricia had spent the last month carefully constructing. The silk of her dress, a muted charcoal that Patricia had insisted she wear to reflect her mourning, felt like a shroud against her skin. "It's a tragedy, truly," Patricia continued, her voice projecting to the back of the room with the practiced ease of a stage actress. She turned to the chairman of the board, her eyes glistening with fake tears. "The fire at the warehouse didn't just take the inventory. It took my niece's spirit. She hasn't been the same since the night of the accident. We've decided a long sabbatical in a private facility is the only way forward." Evelyn felt the bite of the cold condensation from the glass she held. She looked up, catching the gaze of Richard Carter. Her uncle stood a few feet away, his face a mask of weak-willed discomfort. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He was too busy checking the gold Rolex on his wrist, the one Evelyn knew had been bought with the first installment of the insurance payout from the very fire that had nearly killed her. "I'm sure everyone understands," Patricia whispered, leaning closer so the scent of her expensive, sharp perfume filled Evelyn's lungs. "Evelyn needs rest, far away from the pressures of the family business." A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Aunt Margaret, standing near the buffet, dabbed at her eyes, her face twisted in a mixture of pity and genuine horror. The narrative was set. In the eyes of the city's elite, Evelyn was no longer the brilliant project manager who had doubled the company's valuation in 3 years. She was a liability, a broken girl who had lost her mind in the smoke. Patricia's grip on her hand tightened, a silent warning. "Say something, dear. Tell them you're grateful for the family's support." Evelyn lowered her head, letting a stray lock of hair hide the cold clarity in her eyes. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice thin and trembling. "See," Patricia turned back to the donors, a triumphant smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "She's barely here, it's for the best." As Patricia moved away to charm a group of investors, Evelyn stepped back into the shadows of a velvet curtain. The rage was a cold, hard knot in her chest, but she kept her breathing shallow and ragged. She reached into her small silk clutch, her fingers brushing against the smooth, cool casing of a high-end digital recorder. It was active. It had been active since the moment she stepped out of the car. She watched Patricia across the room. Her aunt was radiant, holding court with a glass of vintage crystal, laughing as she recounted a sanitized version of the fire. She looked like the savior of the Carter legacy. She didn't look like a woman who had stood in the shadow of a warehouse with a gallon of accelerant and a box of matches. "You look like you've seen a ghost," a voice whispered beside her. Evelyn didn't flinch. She knew the cadence of that voice. It was Jason Park, her lead developer and the only person who had seen through the breakdown act from day one. He stood with his back to her, pretending to study a painting on the wall. "I've seen a monster, Jason," she replied, her voice barely a breath. "She just told the board I'm being committed." "The documents you asked for are in the safe house," Jason said, his tone professional and detached for any onlookers. "The fire investigator, Marcus Webb, found the traces of the incendiary device. It wasn't an electrical short, not even close." Evelyn felt a surge of adrenaline, but she kept her posture slumped. "And the bank records. Richard's gambling debts are all there. $3 million in the red, paid off 48 hours after the warehouse went up. It's a paper trail a mile wide, Evelyn." She looked at her aunt again. Patricia was leaning in close to the board chairman, her hand on his arm, likely securing the vote to strip Evelyn of her remaining shares. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Patricia wasn't just stealing the company. She was stealing Evelyn's very identity, labeling her insane to ensure no one would ever listen to her side of the story. Wait for it, Evelyn whispered to herself. Wait for what? Jason asked. The moment she thinks she's won everything, Evelyn said, her voice finally losing its tremor. The board meeting is in 3 days. That's when the foundation celebrates the new recovery plan. I want everything ready by then. The forensic reports, the recordings, the debt ledgers, all of it. She's going to push the commitment papers tonight, Evelyn. She told Richard to have the car ready for the facility at midnight. Evelyn's lips curved into a tiny, lethal smile that never reached her eyes. Let her try. She thinks she's moving a broken girl into a cage. She doesn't realize she's just giving me the perfect alibi. She stepped out from the shadows, her face instantly melting back into a mask of dazed confusion. She wandered toward Patricia, who was now laughing at something the chairman had said. Aunt Patricia, Evelyn murmured, loud enough for the nearby donors to hear. I think I'm ready to go now. My head hurts. Patricia turned, her expression softening into that terrifying maternal mask. Of course, darling, the car is waiting. We've taken care of everything. You don't have to worry about a single thing ever again. As Patricia led her toward the exit, her hand firm on Evelyn's elbow like a jailer, Evelyn felt the weight of the recorder in her bag. She had the concern. She had the public humiliation. And in 72 hours, she would have the reckoning. Patricia leaned in as they reached the heavy oak doors of the gala hall, her voice dropping to a hiss that only Evelyn could hear. You should have stayed in the fire, you little brat. It would have been so much cleaner for everyone. Evelyn didn't blink. She just nodded vaguely, letting Patricia lead her out into the cold night air. The game had officially begun, and Patricia Carter had no idea she had just handed the winning card to the girl she thought she had destroyed. The next morning, the sun bled through the heavy velvet curtains of the guest wing at the Carter estate. Evelyn Carter lay perfectly still, her head throbbing with the rhythmic pulse of a lingering migraine, but her mind was sharper than it had been in months. The previous night's orchestrated humiliation at the gala still burned, yet it was the cold hiss of Patricia's voice, the whispered wish that she had died in the fire, that fueled her now. She heard the rhythmic clink of silver against porcelain from the terrace below. Her aunt and uncle were already performing the role of the grieving, burdened guardians for the benefit of the household staff. Evelyn sat up, her fingers grazing the hidden pocket of her bag, where the digital recorder lay. The concern Patricia had displayed was a mask, and Evelyn finally had the proof of the rot beneath the porcelain. When she finally descended the grand staircase, the scent of expensive jasmine tea and freshly polished mahogany filled the foyer. Patricia Carter sat at the head of the glass-topped table, her silk robe shimmering like oil on water in the morning light. She didn't look up from her tablet, but her voice was like a lash. You're late, Evelyn. We have a busy day of appointments. The doctor will be here at 10 to discuss your cognitive regression. Richard Carter sat across from her, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped a crystal glass of orange juice. He wouldn't meet Evelyn's eyes. He never did when his wife was in a mood, or when his gambling debts were mounting, which lately was every day. I'm feeling much better, Patricia, Evelyn said, her voice carefully neutral. She took a seat, the cold iron of the chair pressing against her spine through her thin sweater. I don't think a doctor is necessary. Patricia finally looked up, her eyes hard and predatory. Necessity isn't for you to decide. After your performance last night, the board is concerned. Richard and I have decided that for the sake of the company and your own health, you need to step back. Permanently. She slid a heavy, cream-colored folder across the table. The gold-embossed Carter crest mocked Evelyn from the cover. These are the papers for a voluntary medical conservatorship. Sign them, and we can avoid a public hearing. The audacity of the move made Evelyn's pulse spike. They weren't just trying to hide her. They were trying to erase her legal existence to protect the fraudulent insurance claims they'd filed after the fire. They wanted her silenced, declared incompetent, and tucked away in a private facility where she couldn't ask questions about the blueprints. And if I don't? Evelyn asked, her voice steady. Richard finally spoke, his voice thin and desperate. Evelyn, please, don't make this harder than it has to be. We're trying to protect the family legacy. You're not thinking clearly. You mean your gambling credit, Richard? Evelyn's voice was a whisper, but it hit like a physical blow. Richard went pale, the glass rattling against the table as he set it down. Patricia slammed her hand down, the jasmine tea sloshing onto the white linen. "That is enough. You are unstable and you will do as you are told. You have until the legacy announcement in 72 hours to realize that without us, you are nothing. You have no home, no job, and no one who believes a word you say." Evelyn stood, her chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. Instead, she felt the satisfying weight of the burner phone Jason Park had slipped her weeks ago, tucked safely into the waistband of her leggings. "I understand perfectly," she said, turning toward the gardens. Once she was hidden behind the towering, manicured hedges of the labyrinth, she pulled out the phone. Her fingers flew across the screen, dialing a number she had memorized years ago. "Jason, it's me. I'm out of the house for an hour," she whispered into the receiver. "Did you get the files from the server before they wiped my access?" "Every single one." Jason Park's voice was a frantic but loyal comfort in her ear. "Evelyn, if they find out you have the original blueprints for the fire suppression system, the ones that prove the accident was impossible, they won't just try to commit you. They'll do much worse." "I know," she said, watching Patricia through the glass of the conservatory from a distance. Her aunt was already on her own phone, likely calling the very doctor she'd threatened Evelyn with. "But they think I'm broken. They think the fire took my memory along with my home. They're so blinded by their own greed that they can't see the lion in the room." "What's the move?" Jason asked. Evelyn looked at the countdown clock on the phone's home screen. 3 days. 72 hours until the Carters stood before the world to claim the inheritance that belonged to her. "Tell Marcus Webb to meet us at the safe house tonight," Evelyn said, her voice turning to ice. "The Carters want a public announcement. I'm going to give them a premiere they'll never forget." 2 hours later, the industrial hum of the city felt like a physical weight against the windows of the safe house. Evelyn stood by the workstation in Jason's loft, the scent of ozone and burnt coffee grounding her as she watched the rain lash against the reinforced glass. Her hands were steady now, the tremor that she had performed so convincingly for Patricia earlier having vanished the moment she stepped through the door. Jason Park sat hunched over a triple monitor setup, his fingers dancing across the keys with a rhythmic click that filled the silence. He didn't look up when the heavy steel door at the far end of the room groaned open. Marcus Webb stepped inside, shaking a wet trench coat. The fire investigator looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red, but he carried a black leather courier bag with a grip that suggested it contained the crown jewels. "I have the accelerant profiles," Marcus said, his voice a low gravel. He walked to the center table and unzipped the bag, pulling out a thick, tabbed folder. "The lab in Chicago finished the chromatography an hour ago. The fire that leveled your home wasn't just a failure of the suppression system, Evelyn. It was a chemical execution." Evelyn moved toward the table, her eyes scanning the data. "Is it linked?" "Beyond a doubt." Marcus pointed to a jagged graph. "The traces found in the primary bedroom's floor joists match a specific industrial solvent used in Richard's furniture restoration business. It's a rare compound, discontinued 3 years ago due to its volatility. Richard Carter bought the last 6 crates of it from a liquidator in June, 3 weeks before the accident." The rage flickered in Evelyn's chest, a cold, sharp blade. She could almost smell the smoke again, feel the searing heat that had chased her through the hallways of the house she had built with her own sweat. Richard had been the one to pour the liquid, but she knew Patricia had been the one to hand him the match. "He's a gambler in debt to his neck," Marcus continued, pulling out a second set of documents. "Jason helped me pull the offshore accounts." Richard didn't just lose the inheritance. He lost money he didn't have. He was 3 days away from having his kneecaps broken when your house went up. The insurance payout didn't just save his life, it funded Patricia's new lifestyle. Evelyn touched the edge of the paper, the texture of the forensic report rough against her fingertips. "They didn't just want the money, they wanted me gone. If I hadn't made it to the balcony, this would have been a closed case of faulty wiring and a tragic death." Suddenly, the phone on the table buzzed. The caller ID displayed a name that made the air in the room feel thin: Patricia Carter. Evelyn signaled for silence and swiped the screen, putting it on speaker. "Evelyn, darling." Patricia's voice was a saccharine trill, though the underlying edge of impatience was unmistakable. "I've been trying to reach you. I'm at the boutique for my final fitting for the gala, and the designer is asking about your measurements. Though I told him not to bother. You're looking so peaked lately. Perhaps a simple, loose-fitting wrap would be best, something that doesn't draw too much attention to how much weight you've lost since the incident." Evelyn closed her eyes, her jaw tightening. "I'm sure whatever you choose will be appropriate, Aunt Patricia." "I've also spoken to Dr. Aris," Patricia said, her tone shifting into that performative, motherly concern that made Evelyn's skin crawl. "He's cleared his schedule for Monday morning. We'll take you straight from the gala to the facility. It's for the best, dear. You're clearly not coping. Richard and I just want you to be in a place where you can't hurt yourself, or our family's reputation." "I understand," Evelyn whispered, leaning into the role of the broken victim. "Monday, I'll be ready." "Good girl. Oh, and Evelyn, don't bother bringing that old locket of your mother S to the gala. It's far too heavy for your neck. I've put it in the safe for safekeeping. See you in 48 hours. The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavy. Jason stopped typing, his face pale with indignation. "She's literally planning to lock you away the second she has the inheritance papers signed." "She thinks she's already won," Evelyn said, her voice dropping an octave into a chilling, calm register. She turned back to Marcus. "The gala is the premiere. Patricia wants the world to see her as the grieving matriarch taking over the Carter legacy. She wants the spotlight." Marcus leaned over the table. "What's the move, Evelyn?" "We have the accelerant match, the gambling debts, and the suppression system override logs. We could go to the police now." "No," Evelyn said, her eyes fixed on the countdown clock Jason had pinned to the main monitor. 48 hours. "The police can be bought in this city, and Patricia has spent the last month whining and dining the commissioner. If we take this to a precinct, the evidence will vanish before the ink is dry. We need witnesses. We need the kind of public exposure that no amount of money can bury." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive, the one containing the hidden camera footage she'd recovered from the conservatory's birdhouse. "Jason, I need you to bypass the gala's media server," she commanded. "Marcus, get Diana Reeves on the phone. Tell her we're moving to the black bag protocol. I want the restraining orders and the asset freezes ready to be served the moment I step off that stage." Evelyn looked at her reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back wasn't the trembling orphan Patricia expected. She was a ghost coming back for everything they had stolen. "They want a show," Evelyn whispered, the cold drive pressing into her palm. "I'm going to give them a finale they'll never survive." The afternoon before the Gaslight Gala, the Carter estate smelled of cloying lilies and expensive desperation. Evelyn Carter stood in the center of the conservatory, watching the catering staff arrange crystal flutes with surgical precision. The sunlight filtered through the glass panes, catching the sharp edges of the diamond pendant Patricia had gifted her earlier that morning. A piece of jewelry Evelyn knew had been purchased with the insurance payout from the very fire that should have killed her. "Move those arrangements to the left," Patricia Carter commanded, her voice cutting through the humid air like a serrated blade. She stepped into the room, her silk wrap billowing behind her. She didn't look at the staff. She looked at Evelyn with a patronizing tilt of her head. "And Evelyn, dear, do try to stand up straight. You look like a wilted vine. We can't have the donors thinking the family's charity case is regressing." Aunt Margaret, hovering near a display of hors d'oeuvres, flinched at the remark. She glanced at Evelyn, her eyes clouded with a mixture of pity and burgeoning doubt. The older woman had been quiet since the accident, but lately she seemed to be watching the power balance in the house with a nervous intensity. "I'm perfectly fine, Patricia," Evelyn replied, her voice a low, steady hum. She reached into her blazer pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, hard plastic of the encrypted flash drive Jason had delivered an hour ago. The weight of it was a comfort, a physical anchor to the reality Patricia was about to lose. "I've never felt more clear-headed." Patricia let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "Clear-headed? You've spent the last 6 months talking to ghosts and jumping at shadows. Richard and I have already discussed the seating chart. You'll be at the back table near the service entrance. It's for your own protection, really. Less noise, less stimulation." The insult hung in the air, thick and foul. Richard Carter appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from an early afternoon scotch. He didn't meet Evelyn's eyes, instead focusing on the gold leafing of the gala invitations stacked on a nearby marble table. He was the silent partner in her ruin, the man who had held the matches while his wife struck the flint. "Richard, tell her," Patricia prompted, adjusting the collar of her husband's designer suit. "Tell her how much we've sacrificed to keep her reputation intact after her breakdown." Richard cleared his throat, his gaze shifting to the floor. "It's for the best, Evelyn. We have to think about the Foundation's image. People expect a certain stability." Evelyn watched them, the predator and the coward, and felt a chilling sense of detachment. She wasn't the victim they remembered. She was the architect of their upcoming extinction. "I understand completely," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You've both worked so hard to build this image. It would be a shame if anything were to disrupt the narrative." Patricia's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing her face before her habitual arrogance smoothed it over. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Only that tomorrow is a night for legacies," Evelyn said, stepping closer to her stepmother. She could smell the expensive, powdery scent of Patricia's perfume, a fragrance that would forever be linked in her mind to the smell of smoke. "I hope you've prepared your speech carefully. When the lights go up, everyone is going to see exactly who you are." Patricia scoffed, waving a manicured hand as if dismissing a fly. "Your theatrics are exhausting, Evelyn. Go to your room and stay out of the way. The help has enough to do without tripping over you." As Evelyn turned to leave, she caught Diana Reeves entering through the foyer. The lawyer carried a leather briefcase that looked like a weapon in this house of cards. Diana gave Evelyn a single, imperceptible nod, the signal that the asset freezes were locked and the forensic audit was complete. The legal net was cast. All that remained was to pull the cord. Evelyn walked past Patricia, her shoulder brushing the silk of the other woman's wrap. She didn't look back. She could feel the countdown ticking in her chest, a rhythmic, relentless pulse. In her room, she pulled out the gala invitation. It was embossed in gold, a testament to the wealth the Carters had stolen from her father's blood and her own near death. She traced the letters of her own name, then Patricia's. 24 hours, Evelyn whispered to the empty room. She opened her laptop, the screen reflecting in her dark pupils. Jason's final message blinked on the screen. "System override confirmed. The media server is yours." Evelyn leaned back, the shadows of the late afternoon stretching across the floor like reaching fingers. Patricia thought she was hiding a broken girl in the attic. She didn't realize she had invited a ghost to her final celebration, and the ghost was bringing receipts. Tomorrow, the Carters wouldn't just be losing their money. They would be losing the one thing Patricia valued more than gold, the lie of her own innocence. The evening of the Carter Foundation Gala arrived with a stifling humidity that even the ballroom's industrial cooling couldn't quite touch. Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of the grand foyer, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool silk of her emerald gown. It was a color her father had always loved, a deep forest shade that felt like a shield. She watched the elite of the city filter through the gilded doors, their laughter ringing like hollow crystal against the marble floors. Patricia Carter was already at the center of the room, draped in cream lace that screamed purity and benevolence. She held a glass of vintage champagne, her smile practiced and sharp as a razor. To the donors circling her, she was the grieving widow who had turned tragedy into a multi-million-dollar charitable empire. To Evelyn, she was the woman who had watched a house burn with a smile on her face. "You actually came," a voice hissed near Evelyn's ear. She didn't flinch. She turned slowly to find Richard Carter standing there, his tuxedo jacket strained at the buttons and his eyes bloodshot. The scent of expensive bourbon and desperation clung to him like a second skin. He looked toward his wife, then back at Evelyn, his jaw tight. "I wouldn't miss the anniversary of my father's legacy being dismantled," she said, her voice a calm, low vibration. Richard sneered, stepping closer into her personal space. "Don't get self-righteous. You're only here because Patricia has a soft spot for family. If it were up to me, you'd still be in that wellness retreat in the mountains. You look thin, Evelyn, unstable. One wrong word and I'll have security escort you back to the van before the first course is served." Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes unblinking. She noticed the slight tremor in his hand, the way he adjusted his cufflinks every few seconds. He was a man holding onto a sinking ship, terrified of the water. "I'm sure you would, Richard, but we both know who really calls the shots in this house, and Patricia needs me here for the photos. The recovered niece makes for such a touching press release, doesn't it?" He muttered an oath and moved away, heading straight for the bar. Evelyn felt the haptic buzz of her phone against her thigh, 2 short pulses. Jason was in position. The media server was compromised, and the countdown had transitioned from hours to minutes. She moved deeper into the ballroom, the scent of 1,000 lilies cloying and thick. It was the smell of a funeral disguised as a party. She spotted Aunt Margaret near the silent auction tables, looking uncomfortable in a dress that cost more than her annual pension. The older woman's eyes widened when she saw Evelyn, a flicker of genuine relief crossing her face before she glanced fearfully toward Patricia. "Evelyn, dear," Margaret whispered, pulling her into a stiff embrace. "You shouldn't be here. Patricia is. She's in a state tonight. She's been talking about your relapse to the board members all evening. She's setting the stage to have your power of attorney extended." "Let her talk, Aunt Margaret," Evelyn replied, her hand briefly squeezing the older woman's arm. "The higher she builds the stage, the further the drop." Across the room, Patricia noticed the huddle. She excused herself from a group of city council members and glided across the floor, her heels clicking a rhythmic, predatory beat against the parquet. She reached out, her fingers cold as ice as she tucked a stray lock of hair behind Evelyn's ear. It was a gesture of intimacy that felt like a threat. "There she is," Patricia cooed, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of the nearby guests. "Our little miracle. I was just telling the mayor how worried we've been about your fragile state. You look so pale, darling. Are you sure you're up for this? The lights, the noise. It can be so taxing on a mind that's still mending." A few guests offered sympathetic murmurs, their eyes pitying. It was the ultimate gaslight, publicly branding her as broken so that any truth she spoke would be dismissed as a hallucination. Evelyn smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that didn't reach her eyes. "I've never felt clearer, Patricia. In fact, I think tonight is going to be a revelation for everyone. The Foundation has achieved so much in my father's name. It's only fair that the world sees the full extent of the work you've been doing behind the scenes." Patricia's eyes narrowed, the mask of maternal concern slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the predator beneath. "Careful, Evelyn. Gratitude is a much better look on you than ambition. Remember who provided that dress. Remember who kept the creditors from your door while you were recovering." "I remember everything," Evelyn said softly. "Every single detail." The lights in the ballroom flickered twice, the signal for the keynote presentation. Patricia straightened her shoulders, her expression shifting back to one of regal grace. She patted Evelyn's cheek, a dismissive, patronizing gesture. "Stay close to Richard, dear. I wouldn't want you to have one of your episodes in the middle of my speech. It would be so messy." Patricia turned and walked toward the stage, her back straight, her confidence absolute. She climbed the steps, framed by a massive digital screen that currently displayed the Carter Foundation logo in shimmering gold. Richard took his place in the front row, looking like a man awaiting a verdict. Evelyn didn't follow them. Instead, she moved toward the back of the room, merging with the shadows near the technical booth. She saw Diana Reeves standing by the exit, the high-powered lawyer holding a leather briefcase like a weapon. Next to her was Marcus Webb, the fire investigator, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Patricia with the intensity of a man who had finally found the spark. Patricia reached the podium and tapped the microphone. The room went silent, the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation dying instantly. "Friends, colleagues, honored guests," Patricia began, her voice echoing with a warmth that Evelyn knew was hollow. "Tonight, we celebrate legacy. We celebrate the memory of a man who gave everything to this city, and we look forward to a future where that flame never goes out." Evelyn reached into her small clutch and pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over a single icon. On stage, Patricia was gesturing toward the screen, ready to start the commemorative slideshow, the one she thought was filled with curated photos of her own charity work. "But before we look at the numbers," Patricia said, her smile widening as she looked directly at Evelyn in the back of the room, "I want to talk about the cost of secrets." Evelyn's thumb pressed the screen. "I couldn't agree more," Evelyn whispered to the darkness. On the giant screen behind Patricia, the gold logo didn't fade into a slideshow. It flickered, turned blood red, and then a video file began to play. The audio hissed through the high-end speakers, a low, distorted sound that slowly resolved into two familiar voices. The room held its breath. Patricia, still smiling, began to turn around to see what was behind her. Evelyn felt the weight of the last year vanish, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. The trap was sprung, the witnesses were gathered, and the first frame of the real Carter legacy was about to be burned into the minds of everyone in the room. Patricia stood frozen as the grainy footage played behind her. The audio, enhanced by Jason Park's technical wizardry, cut through the ballroom like a serrated blade. Her own voice, stripped of its performative maternal warmth, filled the space, discussing the precise placement of the kerosene. The high-end speakers captured every chilling detail of her plan to frame her own niece for the warehouse fire to cover Richard's mounting gambling debts. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Patricia turned slowly, her neck craning toward the screen as if she could somehow wish the images away. The transformation was visceral. The regal, untouchable matriarch seemed to shrink within her designer gown. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin the shade of wet ash. Her eyes, once bright with the fire of her own ego, became hollow and frantic, darting from the screen to the faces of the donors she had spent years courting. A vein in her temple throbbed visibly, a jagged line of stress against her pale skin. Her mouth worked soundlessly, her lips trembling and slick with a sudden, frantic sweat that broke through her expensive foundation. She looked less like a woman and more like a crumbling monument to her own greed. Aunt Margaret was the first to break the stillness. She stood up, her chair screeching against the polished marble floor, a sound like a dying bird. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as she looked at her sister. "You told us she was sick," Margaret whispered, her voice carrying in the hushed hall. "You told us she was dangerous." Beside her, the board members of the Carter Foundation began to shift. It was a subtle, collective movement, a physical distancing that spoke louder than any verbal condemnation. They pulled their chairs back, creating a literal moat of empty space around the woman they had toasted only moments ago. Richard sat beside his wife, his face buried in his hands, the image of a man who had finally run out of luck. Evelyn didn't rush. She walked toward the stage with a measured, rhythmic stride, the sound of her modest heels clicking with a finality that felt like a countdown. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like the broken girl her aunt had spent months painting for the public. She looked like the storm they had forgotten to account for. "The cost of secrets is high, isn't it?" Evelyn said, her voice low but perfectly clear. She stopped at the edge of the stage, looking up at the woman who had tried to erase her. "You spent so much time worrying about the numbers, Patricia, that you forgot about the truth. You thought my breakdown was your shield. In reality, it was my camouflage." The antagonist finally found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing that cracked under the pressure. This is a fabrication, a desperate girl's fantasy. You're unstable, everyone knows that." "Is it?" Evelyn reached into her clutch and pulled out a single, folded document. She didn't hand it to her aunt or the board. She handed it to Diana Reeves, who had stepped forward from the shadows of the velvet curtains. That is the forensic audit of the insurance claim, verified by the fire marshal's office. And the video? That was recorded from the nursery monitor you forgot was still active in the old house. The room gasped as Diana nodded, her expression grim and professional. Marcus Webb stood nearby, his arms crossed, his presence a silent promise of the handcuffs waiting in the foyer. The smell of ozone from the projector and the cloying, floral scent of Patricia's perfume mixed in the air, creating a suffocating atmosphere. Evelyn leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto her Aunt S. "You told everyone I didn't belong in this family or in this building," she whispered, loud enough for only the front row to hear. "But while you were busy playing the part of the grieving sister, I was buying back the shares you sold to cover Richard's losses. I don't just belong here. I own the ground you're standing on." She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She didn't stay to watch the security team begin their approach. She simply turned her back on the wreckage of the Carter legacy and walked toward the exit. The heavy oak doors swung open, and for the first time in a year, the air outside tasted like nothing but freedom. She could hear the first notes of a frantic explanation beginning behind her, but it was already being drowned out by the sound of justice arriving. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press the oxygen out of the room. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the projector cooling down, its cooling fan whirring like a heartbeat. Patricia Carter stood frozen on the stage, the harsh light from the empty slide washing her face in a sickly, digital blue. Her chest heaved, the thousands of hand-stitched sequins on her designer gown catching the light like shards of jagged glass. "It's a lie," Patricia finally whispered, her voice a thin, cracking thread. She looked out at the sea of faces, the board members, the investors, the family friends she had spent years cultivating. "It's a forgery. Evelyn is unstable. We all know she's been having a breakdown since the fire. This is a desperate, pathetic attempt to lash out." She turned to Richard Carter, her hand outstretched, searching for the familiar anchor of his support. But Richard didn't move. He sat in the front row, his face the color of ash, staring at the floor. He knew the gambling debts were real. He knew the signatures on the share transfers were authentic. He looked less like a husband and more like a man watching his own execution. Aunt Margaret was the first to break the physical spell of the room. She stood up slowly, her silk wrap sliding from her shoulders to the floor. She didn't look at the stage with pity. She looked at her sister with a cold, piercing clarity. "I recognize the signatures, Patricia," she said, her voice carrying through the hall without the need for a microphone. "I saw the dates. You were selling off the family legacy while the smoke was still rising from the warehouse." Patricia's face didn't just pale. It seemed to physically collapse. The arrogance that had served as her armor for decades melted away, leaving behind something small, panicked, and ugly. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for one friendly face, but she found only a wall of judgment. A blotchy, angry red heat climbed up her neck, clashing violently with the expensive, pale foundation she wore. Her lower lip began to tremble, a frantic, rhythmic twitch she couldn't control, and her jaw hung slightly slack, as if the muscles had simply given up. The woman who had spent 30 years as the queen of the Carter social circle now looked like a cornered animal, sweating through her perfume. "The audit is already in the hands of the district attorney," a voice rang out from the back of the hall. Diana Reeves stepped forward, her heels clicking with military precision against the polished marble. She held a leather-bound folder as if it were a weapon. "And Marcus Webb has the fire marshal's supplemental report. We aren't just talking about corporate fraud anymore, Patricia. We're talking about arson and insurance secondary-degree felony charges." The murmurs began then, a low, rising tide of scandal. The board members at the center table began to physically shift their chairs, creating a widening gap of empty space around the Carter family. It was a silent, social excommunication. Patricia's eyes found Evelyn, who was standing near the heavy oak exit doors. Evelyn didn't look triumphant. She looked remarkably, terrifyingly calm. She was adjusting the strap of her modest handbag, her posture straight and her expression unreadable. "You think you've won?" Patricia screamed, her voice finally breaking into a shrill, jagged edge. She lunged toward the edge of the stage, her fingers clawing at the air. "You're nothing. You're a project manager. I built this life. I am the Carter name." "No," Evelyn said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Patricia's hysterics like a blade through silk. "You're a tenant, and your lease just expired." Evelyn turned her back on the chaos. She could hear the sound of a champagne glass shattering somewhere behind her, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of security boots entering the hall. The smell of the rain-washed night air began to pull at her as she stepped into the foyer, leaving the cloying scent of lilies and betrayal behind. In the hallway, Marcus Webb was waiting, leaning against a marble pillar with a cell phone in his hand. He gave a short, sharp nod as she approached. "The units are out front. They're waiting for the signal from Reeves to move in and secure the records." "Let them," Evelyn said, her voice steady. She felt a strange, cold lightness in her chest. The weight she had carried for a year, the grief, the suspicion, the forced silence, was gone. She walked past the portraits of her ancestors that lined the long corridor. They seemed different now, no longer looming judges of her failure, but witnesses to her reclamation. As she reached the main entrance, she saw Jason Park waiting by the curb, the engine of the car idling softly in the damp night. "Evelyn." She stopped, her hand on the heavy brass handle of the front door. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Richard. He sounded smaller than she had ever heard him, the bravado of the gambler completely stripped away. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty foyer. "Where are we supposed to go?" Evelyn looked at the rain-slicked driveway, where the blue and red lights of the arriving authorities were just beginning to crest the hill. She didn't look back at the uncle who had watched her world burn and said nothing. "The same place you sent me, Richard," she said, her voice as cold as the marble beneath her feet. "Nowhere." She stepped out into the night, the heavy doors clicking shut behind her with a sound of finality that echoed like a gavel. The house was no longer a home, it was a crime scene. And as the first police cruiser pulled into the circular drive, Evelyn Carter didn't look back at the wreckage. She got into the car and watched the house of cards disappear in the rearview mirror. 6 months had passed since the smoke finally cleared from the Carter estate, but the scent of charred oak still seemed to linger in the back of Evelyn's throat whenever the wind turned cold. She stood in the center of a sun-drenched studio on the 42nd floor of a glass tower, the city of Chicago sprawling beneath her like a map of possibilities. The air here smelled of fresh espresso and expensive stationery, a sharp, clean contrast to the damp ash she had left behind. Evelyn Carter smoothed the front of her tailored charcoal blazer. She wasn't the woman who had spent months feigning a breakdown in a darkened bedroom anymore. Her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed someone with sharp eyes and steady hands, a woman who had reclaimed her life by burning down the lies that had sought to smother it. The door to her private office opened, and Jason Park stepped in, carrying a tablet and a look of quiet satisfaction. He didn't say a word as he handed her the device. On the screen was a news clipping from the local Gazette. The headline was small, tucked away in the legal notices, but it carried the weight of a mountain: final sentencing in Carter arson case. "She tried to file for an appeal this morning," Jason said, his voice echoing slightly in the minimalist space. The judge threw it out in less than 10 minutes. The forensic evidence Marcus Webb provided was too airtight. There's no coming back from a paper trail that leads directly to a gasoline canister. Evelyn scrolled through the article. Patricia Carter had been sentenced to 15 years for arson and insurance fraud. The court had also ordered the full restitution of the inheritance funds she had siphoned away to cover Richard's gambling debts. "And Richard?" Evelyn asked, her voice calm. "He's in a studio apartment in the industrial district," Jason replied, "working a night shift at a logistics firm." Apparently, none of his old business associates want anything to do with a man whose wife is a convicted felon and whose bank accounts are frozen. Evelyn felt a flicker of something, not joy, but a cold, hard sense of balance. She handed the tablet back. "Thank you, Jason. That's all." An hour later, Evelyn arrived at the state correctional facility. She hadn't planned on coming here, but the need for a final period at the end of a long, jagged sentence pulled at her. The visiting room was a grim, gray box that hummed with the sound of buzzing fluorescent lights and the low murmur of desperate conversations. It was a place where status went to die, stripped away by metal detectors and orange jumpsuits. When Patricia was led into the room, Evelyn almost didn't recognize her. The woman who had once prided herself on Chanel suits and perfectly coiffed hair looked diminished. Her skin was sallow under the harsh lights, and her hands, once adorned with diamonds bought with stolen money, were cracked and bare. She sat down heavily, the plastic chair scraping against the linoleum with a shrill, jarring sound. "You look terrible, Patricia," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into the quiet space between them. Patricia's eyes snapped up, flashing with a remnant of the old venom. "Are you happy now? You've destroyed everything. The family name, the house, our lives. You're a monster, Evelyn." "I didn't light the match," Evelyn replied, leaning forward just enough to see the panic swirling in the older woman's pupils. "You did that. I just made sure the world saw the fire." "We were family," Patricia hissed, her voice cracking. "We took you in." "You took me in so you could pick my pockets while I grieved," Evelyn said, her tone as sharp as a razor. "You thought because I was quiet, I was weak. You thought because I was hurting, I was blind. That was your biggest mistake. You underestimated the person who had nothing left to lose." Patricia reached out, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to grab Evelyn's throat, but the guard stepped forward, a silent warning. Patricia slumped back, her shoulders shaking. "Richard is a shell. He can't even look at me. You took my husband from me." "Richard took himself away the moment he chose a poker table over his soul," Evelyn said. She stood up, the movement fluid and graceful. "I didn't come here to gloat. I came here to tell you that the house is being razed. I sold the land to a conservancy. It's going to be a public park. No one will ever live in that tomb again." The color drained from Patricia's face, a gray mask of realization. The legacy she had burned a home to protect was being turned into grass and trees for strangers to walk on. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out, just a ragged, broken gasp. Evelyn turned and walked away, the heavy steel door thudding shut behind her. Outside, the air was crisp. Aunt Margaret was waiting by the car, her face etched with a mixture of sadness and relief. She had been the one to finally provide the testimony about the missing family heirlooms Patricia had pawned months before the fire. "Is it done?" Margaret asked, clutching her coat tight against the wind. "It's done," Evelyn said. "She'll never forgive you, you know," Margaret whispered. "I don't need her forgiveness," Evelyn replied, looking up at the sky. "I have my father's name back. That's enough." But as they drove away from the prison, Evelyn looked at her own hands. They were steady, yes, but they felt heavy. She had one. She had her wealth, her reputation, and her justice. But the house where she had grown up was gone, replaced by a black scar on the earth. Her uncle was a ghost, and her family was a wreckage of court filings and bitter memories. She had built a new life on the ashes of the old one, but as she watched the prison fade in the rearview mirror, she knew the price of ashes was always higher than anyone expected. The victory was absolute, but the silence it left behind was deafening.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.